thought better of it because I figured the background noise. But just happened to also have a friend that was like, yeah, you can, come over to my house. So.
All right. So hello, everyone out there in the wide world. My name is Thomas Flynn. I'm being joined today by the inimitable and distinguished Devin Fraze. And as you may know, we're going to be talking about learning, human learning inside and outside of the system. And rather than start an abstraction, Devin is involved with the project, a learning cooperative effort in Columbus, Ohio. And Devin, why don't you start by describing the cooperative, the project as you guys are undertaking it there, and then we can just take that as our point of departure.
Sure, yeah. Well, the Columbus Learning Cooperative, the core kind of idea is that, learning is innate to every human and, doesn't need to be forced upon the child. And you work kind of with that natural curiosity inborn and provide a lot of really great resources. And that's kind of what we're looking to do is, work with families, creating very individualized learning plans for every kid, and work with their passions to help them actually make learning fun, make it enjoyable, make it relevant in their life. That's what we do.
So is this analogous to, say, a Montessori tact, or how does it relate to other learning modalities or approaches?
Yeah, when I was in university, I was studying to become a high school math teacher, and the classic kind of modality of public school was all I had known. And then when I started to branch out, I discovered things like Waldorf and Montessori. And then I even went further down the rabbit hole of what alternative education can be, discovering things like circle schools, free democratic schools, Sudbury schools, and even unschooling. And where we kind of fall on that spectrum is we definitely incorporate a lot of the alternative methodologies of Montessori. But we don't use all that same methodology. We go a little further. We try to add on some of the other core philosophies we've pulled from these other models, such as democratic schools or Sudbury schools. But in general, we overlap with Montessori and things like age mixing. I really love that concept. That if you're 12 and you're wanting to maybe study alongside 17-year-olds learning calculus, and you're ready for that, mentally you've done the prerequisites, or you are a mathematical minded person or something, then you should be there next to them. You shouldn't, say, well, 12, so you have to only be grouped by your age. It's very factory style learning when we, group children by their quantifiable standards.
So could you, that's one concrete example of a tactic, if you like, that you're employing. Maybe you could give us two or three other specific manners in which you are approaching some dimension or facet of the learning process in a way which is different or differentiable from what you are going to encounter in a conventional framework. That is, you're going through a parochial or public school course.
Yeah, happily. So one of the really major things where we depart is the idea of compulsory education. And while it can seem scary to a lot of parents that never maybe heard of the idea that if you don't force a kid to learn, they're you'd think they're just gonna play video games all day. But really we come at the education with the idea of non-compulsory nature. So we work with the family, work with the kid to say, hey, what do you want to be learning? And then how can we, provide you the best in doing that? And so if they're, for example, that kid might not take a math class their first year with us. They might wait a little bit, which is could seem, ludicrous in the public schooling where you have to have your math class, and that's forced upon you. And what I've experienced as a teacher then is you have these kids in your class where they'd really rather be studying, say, history. I mean, they love history, but instead they're stuck in your class, and so they're just sleeping in the back. And that really does nothing. I mean, having a child sitting in class with me with their head down is a waste of their time. Or worse, maybe they're now, conversing in the back with other kids. They've actually started to take away from the whole environment. And so forcing them in no way actually provides a benefit. And so we kind of say, hey, what do you want to be doing? Let's go become incredible at that. And things like math naturally arise anyway, so trusting that to come around. There's actually a really incredible study that was done in 1928. So a lot of parents come at me and they say, well, Devin, philosophically, I really, I agree. And I think, the non-compulsory nature is great. But that could never actually work. But there's this great study done where in one school district in particular, they decided to change it up a little bit. And so for the first 6 years, so 1 through 5, or kindergarten through 5th grade, they didn't teach any formal mathematics. They just, they played games, they, did puzzles, stuff like that. So they kind of still were maybe mathematically minded thinking, but there's not many, you have to do these worksheets, you have to do these busy work kind of stuff. Come 6th grade, they test the kids. Obviously, they haven't learned any formal mathematics. They don't know the curriculum. They fail the test. They start the curriculum that year, and 6 months later, they test them again. They've completely caught up to their age peers in mathematics. They did 6 years worth of busy work basically in 6 months. 6 months after that, they were now testing above because, again, they kind of let the learning of that mathematics happen at a much more natural speed and a much more natural age, the formalized version. You need to have a developmentally be further along to understand some of these concepts. And the kids just picked it up. So that just kind of is a prime example of, learning doesn't have to be structured or forced. You can let it delay for when the kids are ready and then enter, when they are ready, and they'll pick it up much more efficiently and much more faster. So they just need to be that. That's what the non-compulsory, letting the kids miss out on a few things, but they'll end up learning when they do anyway.
I mean, what occurs to me, and you're talking about that, is that there are two things. On one hand, it actually, I think, relates to what you were saying about age mixing, or, just sort of jettisoning the idea that you have to have this fidelity to a particular sequence, whether that be strictly mapped onto one's age or the grade system or what have you. The other thing that occurred to me in terms of like the pace of apprehension, and the way you put it was that, well, you don't want to necessarily be teaching these kids these things in their 3rd grade as opposed to 6th grade in virtue of developmental considerations. However, on the other side of the coin, I'm wondering if maybe the problem is in part not that the kids are developmentally unprepared for the assimilation of a certain level of material, but that the material is actually presented in a conventional context at an abated or abbreviated pace, and it's actually as a consequence boring to the 1st or the 2nd or the 3rd grade mind. In other words, the kids are actually capable of learning far faster than the system wants them to learn. And part of the reason that we have the problems that we do is that the material is presented in a demeaning fashion, which actually alienates the student. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a mixed bag with exactly that. In that many children perhaps would advance much farther, much faster at the early ages if they were allowed to, while some others actually do developmentally need just more time. And that's really kind of where we come break the mold there too, is the individualized learning plan. And allowing that to, with that one story, that was about, again, traditional public school just introducing the curriculum later, and that's not what we do. We would try to create the personalized plan. So if you do learn things, or if you are ready at an earlier age to just dig in and learn fast, go deep into any topic, then, do that, because that's, the learning should match what you need as the learner, versus any sort of conventional plan. The teach to the middle kind of tactic that's used in public schools today, it's necessary because of how it's set up. It's designed poorly. And so you got 10% of the kids right in the middle that are like, perfect, this is exactly what I need right now. The rest of the kids are either way ahead and they're bored, right? They've been assaulted by this, like, okay, we're doing addition now. Gosh, I did that. I learned that in a day. We're going to spend 3 weeks doing that. Or they're behind. They're like, they feel lost, and then that also shuts their brain down, and they just need to go a little slower, maybe to that part. I mean, again, every kid's different, so maybe they learn addition and subtraction very quickly. Multiplication takes a little bit longer. This is all very basic mathematics, but it's easy to extrapolate that to higher stuff. And so the rate of your learning isn't always consistent with each kid as well. And that's, again, why it's so important to have the personalized plan, because it really isn't about trying to do this one solid rate for one solid down the middle type of student. It should really mimic every single kid's needs.
So as long as we're just sort of sketching some of the aspects of approaching things alternatively, I think a common concern about putting a child outside of the established or conventional frameworks is socialization. Like, well, okay, fine, you can take the kid outside of a public school or an analog, and you can homeschool them, or you can do something like what you guys are doing. But then how about their ability to interact with other people? Are they going to suffer and become sort of socially maladept? How do you approach that concern?
Yeah, that's one that I hear from parents a lot. I feel like, I don't know if you're just, where you come with these concerns, but it's definitely at the heart of a lot of families. One thing that schools typically don't address anyway is we talk more about the academics. But the reality is, being a human being has a lot more than just what you can list off through rote memorization, or even what you're able to do as a job. How can you effectively process your emotions, build friend groups, existing in the world, have healthy relationships. So that's something that we integrate in our programs. We want to actually teach classes on. But as far as developmental progress happening with other kids, because that's important too. You can't just have all knowledge coming from somebody above you. You have to be learning with your peers as well. That's really kind of what what I think in general, kind of like Sudbury or type of learning, or North Star type of learning, or what we kind of do is great with, is that allowing the relationships to form between the kids and giving that space and time there. And in a homeschool setting, it would be the prime example of the lack of socialization worry. A lot of parents mitigate that well by signing their kids up for sports teams, for clubs. They might be, learning one-on-one, or might be learning even solo during the day. But then there's always, if you're a good homeschool parent, so you're finding ways to integrate your kids into other kids' lives. But really, even in school, typical public school, it's almost like being homeschooled. You're sitting there, you're not really able to talk and communicate with your friends next to you. You're not actually able to really have a whole lot of conversation. It's more about, being lectured at. It's not as participatory. That's changing. They're starting to do that change. Maybe during lunchtime, if recess is still available at your school, then you can have that friends. But it's still happening afterwards. It's still happening in the clubs. It's still happening. You're going to your friend's house. Your friend is just some guy that's in your math class. You don't really know through the math class them too much, but you know them through hanging out afterward. And what actually kind of can happen with us is really there is that space to, I think, truly interact with the kids. And I lost you, Tom, but maybe they'll come back. Interact with the kids in a more the kids can interact with other kids in more meaningful ways. Working on projects together. Having more free time if there is a need at that moment to process the social aspects. You might get cut off traditionally in school. You're like, hey, I have to run the class. We can't, resolve this social issue right now. But having the way our program's set up, the kids have the time to do that. So I see you are coming back now. How about you join in again?
I had a hiccup there. Sorry about that. So, well, I mean, maybe we can sort of shift the terrain slightly, because this is sort of more programmatic how we've been going through the process so far, and back up and be sort of slightly more philosophical. What do you think education is? What does that mean to pursue education? Well, I could go on. I'll leave the question open and then see what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think having a philosophy of education was something that as I started to become a professional educator. Hello, Ika Sayed. Nice. Thanks for joining. Having a philosophy is key, and what it means to educate well, and what good learning should feel like, and stuff like that. And these are the questions that the steering committee that I was working with was asking. What we kind of talked about: vision, mission statements, stuff like that. And for me, what I brought to the table was education should be an adventure. It should be a journey, because oftentimes, kind of education becomes this carrot on a stick. I want to get the A. I want to go to college, and it's not actually about deepening your love for a subject. There's this quote that I love, and it's kind of misattributed. I'm not sure who exactly it's by, but I think it's made perhaps by this guy named Antoine de Sainte-Exupery. I can't actually. It's French. You could probably pronounce it. I can't. But the quote is: if you want to sail the ocean, don't teach a man to build a ship. Don't teach him how to cut the trees and drag logs and work the wood. Teach him to long for the ocean, and the rest will kind of come. So build that passion. And so, my philosophy of education is following your passions and really enjoying that journey. And that journey means a lot of failures too. In public schools, again, traditionally, sorry to be railing on them. They do some stuff well. It works for some families, but traditionally, you get an F and you feel really bad. But you look at anybody in the world that's successful at anything, and they have failed countless amounts of times. The fact that they're successful now is just the end, the journey, but it's not about that failure. So yeah, there's risk that just comes from. Yes, thank you. And how do you pronounce that, Tom? Do you know? I can't hear you. Sorry.
I muted myself. Antoine de Sainte-Exupery. But he wrote Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, right? Which has that wonderful little there's so much that's great about that book, but you have that picture. He shows this picture and oh, well, what is that? Is that a hat? Or that's what the grown-ups think it is. But in fact, it's not a hat. It's a snake that just ate something. And it's just it opens the fable about the different lenses through which we see the world and the consequences, which pertains to what's happening with education, and an issue arises with that in terms of should education. It's sort of obvious what the answer to this is. Should education be enriching and enabling us to see the world with more and different lenses, or should it rather constrict the aperture through which we're looking so that only fewer and fewer interpretations seem viable? Now, I think it's very uncommon that you're going to find a person who's explicitly going to advocate for the latter. Very few people are going to say, oh, well, obviously, if we're going to educate, we want to sort of narrow the shutters through which people are looking at the world. We want it to be expansive and liberating, thus the liberal education. But despite the fact that lip service is given to that idea, I think that in fact what you encounter is precisely such a narrowing in the conventional framework. And in part that's calculated because it's subordinating the process to a particular set of objectives. Part of it, though, is just happenstance, inefficiency, incompetence, just human error of an innocent variety. All those things are going on in a mix, right? So, that just goes to what you were saying about. I got distracted. You started with the quote about Sainte-Exupery.
But it does get down to the, what is the point of education, and so, and what is good learning, and why do we learn? But there's obviously the reason why we specifically learn, but then of course there's the broader question of what should be taught in schools. What is the purpose of education for society? Standards going. And it's interesting. I read a book. What really derailed me from my path originally to public school was a book called Weapons of Mass Instruction, which is a clever title, kind of hinting at the idea that the way public ed is structured, isn't maybe for exactly the reason we all think it should be structured. And you go back to the history again of where it came from, and you look at the first public schools really coming from the industrial era, where we needed more factory workers. Needed for a capitalist society to emerge, and so the process was you had these farmers, very self-directed, very kind of like worked on their own scale, their own time. And we needed to have them work doing rigorous tasks over long, boring, repetitive tasks over a large number of hours. They needed to move when bells rang. They needed to listen to authority figures effectively. And so in John Taylor Gatto's book, he really, he says, like, this education system is not to make you a well-rounded, intelligent person. It is to prepare you for factory labor. And the fact that our education model has changed very little since that time is really a shame, because first of all, those jobs don't really exist too much today in our economy. If you want to be participatory, we really need creative job creators. People that are able to flex well with varying number of tasks, that are able to problem solve very difficult tasks, like what are we going to do about the environment, for example, is a big one that is plaguing the world today. How do we, deal with the political corruption that's around, and we really want to have thinkers that aren't all very linear, like the factory model, and aren't as narrow as you were kind of mentioning earlier. We've become. We want to believe we're delving onto a lot of different topics, but still actually
So I think this actually relates back to a question that Said asked. What about risk coming from progress? And I think that the challenge with an alternative educational framework is that you are sort of shaping or sculpting the student. That's I just noticed that the way I phrased that is problematic because of how it puts the agency, right? Yeah, and we can sort of return to that question of agency accordingly, right? But in any event, you are... the process is likely to translate into human beings who will not cooperate, or will at least be inclined to exhibit great friction with the standard institutional frameworks. And the consequence would be perhaps a destabilization of the society in which these human beings are participating. If you don't have a fidelity to these overarching institutions, and concomitantly the value sets which underwrite those institutions and which those institutions underwrite, then you're going to invite this anarchic outcome. Or so I suppose the traditionalist counterpoint would go. And that is the risk that comes with what we are here sort of treating to be a more progressive educational model. How do you respond to that alternative perspective?
Yeah, and I've heard it from not any parents, but other adults that I've been mentioning, what our program's doing. They're like, but hey, don't we need kids that will really fit neatly into our current societal model? Don't we want like, they didn't say little robots, but like, don't we want people that aren't going to stray too far from what the standard thing is? And it really, the onus on about, particularly in that situation, it shouldn't be on me to decide what your child should do. I obviously have my own personal beliefs. I'm not particularly happy with the way everything's set up in society right now, so I don't particularly think we should try to really just do the best we can to get everyone to fit in and keep things going, status quo. But at the same time, my belief is we need different options out there. We need different methodologies for a way to do things. So really what our program's trying to do is
Your audio.
We're going to work with the children and the families to make, again, learning plans that really mimic what they want. And so if they want their kid, they say, hey, I want my kid to be able to work the 9 to 5 at Chase Bank. Like, that's my goal for my kid. Great. We can create a plan that makes them fit well in and reduces that risk of not fitting. But if they say, hey, I want my kid to be a happy, everyone's going to be happy, but I want my kid to really walk a different path from the standard narrative. We're able to create that different path that really mimics those kids, whatever that child's learning style is and life goals are.
I might actually take a somewhat stronger tact.
Sure, of course, and I think again, worth taking. So tell me more.
With respect to the conservative narrative, that you actually need to inculcate a certain deference in the young to tradition and traditional values. It seems that is actually predicated on an unduly pessimistic view of human beings. In other words, from where I stand, we are fundamentally social creatures, however imperfect we may be. But we have a strong basis for optimism regarding how we are naturally or spontaneously going to relate with each other. And the appeal to the idea of and so as a result, the cultivation of an undue deference to tradition seems to be at best superfluous, but at worst seems to be a mechanism to overwrite our natural congeniality and make us distrustful of each other.
Yes.
Which ironically creates a situation where people are more liable to fit themselves into an authoritarian framework, which actually is conducive to, far more conducive, in my view, to unethical exuberances than a looser orientation or setup.
Yeah.
So the irony, at which I'm hinting, is that authoritarian frameworks actually are incredibly violent and immoral, but they're appealing to morality and tradition as the basis for their legitimacy.
When you have the authoritarian, you're able to relieve the responsibility of the result. Saying like, hey, this institution is taking control of my child's learning. If they end up growing up and having a crappy life or whatever, that's okay because it's the institution and we trust the institution. Versus saying like, hey, the onus for being having a good life is on ourselves. and we need to not trust an authority figure saying what that means. And then you think for yourself a little bit more. You're a little more skeptical, and you're able to not give into some of these more ethical quandaries. You're being thinking for yourself. Someone says, "Hey, I'm going to pay you to cut down the Amazon." You might say, maybe not. Yeah. Versus like if you're just fitting into the authoritarian structure, you're like, yeah, money. I need to do that as a job. I'm not going to fault the tree cutters, but at the same time, they're participating. That's one example of people participating in a destructive and violent means.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is that you have a high quotient of coerciveness in our current situation. Okay. So there are lots of people who are doing things and they themselves may not feel entirely great about, but it's likely there's the perception that they don't have much choice.
Yep.
Right? That our options are actually very limited, which is germane to what's happening in an educational process. Mm-hmm. Whether you're opening a person's ability to see the options on the table or closing them down.
Well, and do you mind if I expound upon that kind of little through there? Yeah. So this idea of really our options. There's this traditional path of like what is good life, and so we think go to elementary school, then middle school, then high school, then college, then get a job, then get married, then die. Like there's like this, like that's life, like almost like set out entirely for you under the traditional kind of like path. And like, what does a job mean, right? Like, well, it means like getting hired to get a 9 to 5, and like I said, having like a career you love or things like that. It's so it's that kind of the traditional path. Mm-hmm. But then when you look at what some of these families or kids or children are able to do when you break off, it's quite incredible. Because you realize how limitless the possibilities for life and the options there are. And not to say that they're 100% of the time life will be the best ever, it'll always work out, but that's true for public school too. I mean, or kind of traditional education as well. You can't ever guarantee even the standard path. So an example to get, and this is really what I want to start out with, to give examples of some incredible things kids can do when they're given the chance to break free from the mold. There was a girl who wanted to, who really loved aviation, and so she started studying that, and on her own, right, by the homeschooler, and started working with other adults that she admired, finding mentors in the aviation industry, and by the age of 16, she had built her own airplane, which she then flew herself, and that just sounds incredible. You have to think this person's a genius, right? And the answer is no, they're not. They were just, they had like that option that traditionally is not available to a kid who's in school from, morning to night, and then has 4 hours of homework afterward, and then has sports. She didn't have those restraints, so she was able to come up with a path that's totally unique to her and honestly really impressive. And so again, at the age of 16, she had done this, and she applied to like MIT and got in. I mean, not again for her. There's still that cultural path that she wanted to go to college, and for some people, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, but when you come to MIT and you say, "Hey, I have a 4.0, and I've joined, I have these 2 clubs," they're kind of like, "Okay, cool. We have a lot of those. Maybe we want you." But you come and say, "Hey, MIT, I may not have a traditional 4.0, but I built my own airplane, and then I also know how to fly, and I'm a self-starter and all this different stuff." That is like a life well lived. That's impressive, and that's kind of where I think we should head as the future as a species of like, doing fulfilling work and doing incredible things instead of just saying, what's the path I should follow? Someone else tell me what to do. Some structure exists so that I can, some authoritarian structure please exist so that you can decide that for me. So that's one example, building your own airplane, real thing.
And I mean, it's not unique. You're pointing out that if we're allowed to be flexible, we can. I mean, of course, there's obviously a social dimension to what's happening, right? And,
not every child has the resources or the people in their life that will help them build their own airplane. Yeah.
So then the question becomes, how does the segment of our society which deals with the task of education serves to ameliorate the fact that you have economic and social variables that undermine the capacity of the individual student to really flourish.
Yeah, and that's that's something that public education is supposed to get rid of, is to be the great equalizer. It's saying, hey, public education paid for taxpayer money, and it's going to free you from the chains of poverty. You could rise out of that. You could learn enough so that you can become happy and successful. But that isn't actually the case, because what ends up happening is schools are paid not just by taxpayer money, but taxpayer money from the houses in the area. And so that means you have schools that are really underfunded because the way it works is like, maybe you're in a rural area or something like that, and so you just can't pay for a nice environment or to efficiently take care of the staff that's taking care of your kids, pay teachers well, basically. And that really ends up kind of becoming a vicious cycle where whole areas get trapped in poverty. And so what the problem then is, like, these big kind of bloated systems, aren't able to properly take care of the kid or the people that are trying to educate the kids. And it just ends up spiraling, creating further economic gaps and stuff like that. And so when you look at how alternative education can serve to actually break families free from that cycle, what you actually end up doing is you end up honoring the resources that are already there. One of the really sad things that probably doesn't get covered in public school textbooks is the education of, for example, Native Americans at one point in time. And so we really, so sadly, worked to erase culture by sending missionary education teachers to areas of, like, Native Americans in the past communities, and then and punishing kids for speaking their native language, and then teaching them, the history of kind of like an oppressive history, like, of the European settlers, and not letting them learn about their own tribes and their own history and stuff like that. And in a way, that still happens today. If you're in a Irish community that actually has a lot of history, but people that are in the community, they're not allowed to interact with children, and they're not allowed just to share, hey, this is the east side of Chicago, and this is what we're proud of, or whatever. This is the west side of Columbus, and this is what we're proud of, and this is what we have going on here. That's not a part of that child's education. And so in a way, you're taking away the wisdom that is already there inherent in impoverished areas, because I think there still exists a lot of wisdom there. So I think the education is then bringing the change makers in the community, in those communities, to the children in those communities, and then you're actually able to help them build up on those different layers of positivity, versus, for example, just shipping in, maybe like a white middle class person into a Chicago suburb and saying, hey, you just teach those kids math and that'll make it all better. Instead of, like, you empower those kids to connect deeper with their communities, to actually grow into wanting to stay there and build a good life and have healthy, successful interrelations with each other and stuff like that. And so I think bring in.
I think what I engaged by in terms of that set of remarks is the fact that you are really pointing to how there is an interface between, and I guess the way I say it sounds almost too obvious, but between what's happening educationally and broader social and political questions of class, race, gender, oppression, and exclusion. It does happen. I mean, the control of the discourse is in the control of the society, and our educational institutions are where a lot of that happens. I mean, for heaven's sake, I mean, from what I hear in Texas, in Arizona, right now there are people who are literally lobbying to rewrite textbooks to exclude, Chicano influence, people from Mexico, writing Mexico out of the history of Texas, right? Which is just like flabbergasting on its face, So, and you really, the mind,
should be interfacing with the real world of adults going on, and it should be able to respond to the communities that it's a part of.
So, but this is, I wanted to raise this question because there's a tension here, and maybe you have some thoughts on it, right? Because, so we're largely similar minds, I think, on many issues, and so for instance, I think we're like mutually kind of almost astonished at these sorts of things that happen where you have the active delegitimation of a community, right? Whether that be an immigrant community or a community of people who are economically disenfranchised by the curricula imposed on the children. But it's not like we're the only players in this game, right? There are people who push back. We've already alluded to that with reference to sort of traditional counterpoints to the approaches that we've cited. Earlier in the conversation, and I did sort of like pushing a little bit, so hopefully this isn't overbearing on my part. But there comes a question of the relationship between an individual parent and parents and their children, and what they're trying to accomplish in their relationship with their children. And some parents and some communities are apparently very interested in conditioning their children to participate in these broader projects, which, in my view, have an oppressive or despotic character to them. We can take an extreme example where a child may, in fact, or a parent may want to actually inculcate racism in their child, but I mean that's an extreme example. Often, it's subtler than that, right? You have the idea that, for example, children should learn to be congenial to a free market system, without appreciating that the free market system itself has some serious issues within it. How does those people how do you respond to that phenomenon? How do you respond?
That's really crucial, and that kind of gets into the more probably positive worry side of well, don't we all need to be learning a standard set of things? I mean, the worry about that isn't so much that we need to inculcate our children into being good capitalists, but so much that we don't want, for example, there to exist some family of extremists, right, that are teaching their kids very negative things, and so we want to protect against that. So by having public ed, we can say, hey, we are going to make sure, for example, evolution is taught in schools. That's one religious thing. A family might want to say, hey, we're going to ignore all modern science and we're going to teach you that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. And that can be problematic if you want to have a society that functions on the idea of, science and critical thinking values and stuff like that. So, or you want to, you have a family that says, we want our child to be racist, or there's the Westboro Baptist Church, they raise their children to spew a lot of vitriol. So that's really, I think, the worry that people have about kind of leaving the idea of public ed, or leaving kind of the idea of education handed down, what we have to be taught. Because oh man, these crazy people are going to come in and they're going to teach their kids the worst stuff, that risk always exists. And I think the problem, it really becomes then learning to let go and trust in kind of greater truth or greater societal forces. I mean, just naturally, usually, I think naturally, in the marketplace of ideas, choosing to be open to loving other human beings is going to be much more beneficial than choosing to hate. You're not going to be, for example, if you're going to be a businessman, a very successful businessman, if every time you meet a black person and you've been raised racist, you say you refuse to do business with them. Because the reality is there are going to be black people in the world that are doing business. You're going to be more successful if you're open-minded and or you're not going to be a very good scientist, if you're just willing to willy-nilly kind of say, well, my faith is this, when you want, I think I want to build a rocket ship, but rockets go up with fuel, not faith. And so it's like, and I'm not trying to ding faith. You can be a person with faith, but you have to also, have certain ideas of societal.
Or, alternatively, if you want to criticize those things, then you have to do it within a social matrix, right? If I'm going to be sort of generous, the way you counter if you want to counter secular hegemony, then you have to meet secular hegemony on its own terms and overtake it that way. You don't counter it by establishing an isolated community, a so-called city on the hill, and then from outside of the broader social and political matrix, institute an attack upon it. That creates a very pathological severance, which undermines human solidarity. And hopefully, human solidarity is a value which transcends a merely secular demarcation.
Exactly. And I think what ends up happening is the power to decide what everyone learns, then you always want to choose your thing, but you have to be, what you believe, but you have to be willing to say, hey, maybe what I believe isn't right. And so, again, allowing that what is right or wrong, what should be taught or shouldn't be taught, or can be learned or can't be learned, being decided in a much more natural, organic way versus trying to do this top-down version, which I think, you could easily slip in. 100 years ago, I'm not saying this is actually true, but it could have been taught that, in the school, in the public school, that negative or bad, bad ideals could have been taught. And that could be a problem in the future. Is for example, maybe you have it worked into the curriculum that more. And I think you're kind of hinting at it as far as like capitalism or free market ideals, learning to be kind of like hidden in the curriculum of how it's set up. So I think it's oftentimes when you have the control,
your audio. Okay. Your audio keeps going in and out. Maybe that might be just on my end. But yeah, I think what you're saying was that we have to be sensitive to the fact that sometimes what's problematic is latent, right? So, for instance, the issue of authoritarianism can find expression. Well, it's not that latent, right? But just in the idea of the school as a space of discipline and the teacher-student relationship as being fundamentally vertical as opposed to horizontal, and the learning process being one of transmission as opposed to, let us say, shared discovery. The teacher is a facilitator, not a dominator. But the way the things work now, the emphasis really is on the latter. And you see that ordinary conversation in the sort of colloquial vision of the teacher as a person who is going to send you to detention and that sort of thing. Or, you could look at Charlie Brown. It just occurred to me. And the Peanuts, right? You have this wonderfully sort of subversive, dismissive attitude toward the conventional schooling framework. Whenever they're at school, they're all at their desks, and then there's teacher. But teacher just goes, wah, 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 wah. In other words, the teacher is actually incomprehensible to the student. It's the other, right? And so there's no effective relationship there. I guess I'm just kind of going off. So, but
it's a great example because when I started studying alternative education models, I looked at different schools or resource centers that kind of do what we're going to be doing when we start up here. There's if they really focus on creating that mentor relationship, or first, and having it be built on trust, having it built on respect between the student and the child and the mentor or teacher, and I mean that's so key, and it feels so much better, and I think the results just end up being a lot better versus having it be the other, having it be Mr. Fraze versus Devin. I mean, the idea is you're trying to be respectful, but why then would not the teacher refer to the student as Mr. whoever, Mrs. whoever, Miss whoever? Respect should go too.
Sometimes you do have old school teachers who do that, but that's old school, which is kind of funny that in like sort of pre-modern and a pre-modern, broadly speaking, educational setup, you actually have a recognition of certain ideals that have been lost. The classical sort of medieval setup, or which makes sense because historically, the role of human relationship figured more obviously in the matter than it does when you put an emphasis on the factory program. The Taylorization.
The analogy is so key, not only in the way that education occurs, but in the way that staffing occurs. Teachers are fully replaceable versus they're integrated in the community. If your teacher, moves, you just hire a new one and put them in. They don't actually have any fabric. They're not actually integrated in the fabric of the thing. Versus the old school, much more so. The teacher in the town, or whatever, was well known. Like people are like, hey, like this, there goes that person that we all like, or maybe don't like. But there's actually a social responsibility. There's actually a deeper connection past just the factory style school where that person is measured 100% of metrics and can be replaced at any point in time, and they don't actually matter how they fit into the.
I think also interesting guy to read in this connection is Foucault. I don't know if you've read Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, or The Birth of the Prison, where he talks about the emergence of a disciplinary society. And one of the crucial techniques in that society is surveillance. And the idea you're always being watched. And this becomes incarnate in all sorts of ways, not the least of which is our architecture. And it shows up in the design of school buildings, even before the implementation explicitly of models after the thinking of certain people in Prussia and so forth, where what you're trying to do is you're actually trying to install a sense of in the students themselves that they have to be self-regulatory, and they have to subordinate themselves to the logic of the authority without being physically punished, so that you can relax the need for corporal discipline because they've already sort of been psychically subjugated. And this is the consequence. Power, not simply as a destructive, but in Foucault's phrasing, a kind of creative or positive force. Not a positive creation, but in other words, something is being actively formed by the operation of power through things like the architecture or standard techniques of discipline, or even certain ways that the curriculum is phrased. So people are encouraged to be paranoid. And it makes them, as a result, actually more submissive. Most of the time, you have outliers who defy the process, but they can then be almost used as examples to sort of demonstrate the system's ultimate power, because they are usually subjected to very harsh countermeasure.
Yeah, I mean, it's inherent in so many different design features, such as the fact that traditional school, the desks are lined facing the front, the children are seated, they're physically below the teacher who's standing, who's commanding with their voice. The room, if a student breaks line, then there's some sort of corporal punishment inflicted, or maybe not. I mean, again, this is what really put me off, is when I was studying education in university. Majority of my classes were on what we call classroom management, or how basically to get kids to sit down and shut up long enough for you to force whatever information into drill into their head. And that just killed me to think I was going to go into classes, I thought, in university and study how to bring math alive, how to integrate the history with the equations and stuff like that. Who came up with it? But instead, it was more about again the management skills. And so we learn these tricks about they call it penny trick, dime trick, or whatever. Of you don't want to spend all your your power currency at once. So if a kid starts to misbehave, you learn to just give them a look. I'm not actually going to punish you. I'm just going to make you realize that there's this power displacement and be like, hey, I'm in control here, without having to actually come in and always bring the hammer down and suspend the kid or give them an attention.
That is actually specifically the issue, the power of the gaze, right? Or the stare is actually, Foucault talks about that, and the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan makes a great deal about the power of the gaze as an implemented power, and Freud does as well. It's actually, it's just funny that you brought that up as an example, because it's explicitly a technique which is predicated on a particular understanding of power relation, right? And I love the way that you put it. Oh, you don't want to spend your power currency. That already admits that it's a power dynamic. And what, power is a reality. Let's not hide from that. But how are you going to shape that reality? How are you going to shape the way that the power is installed? Because you don't have to have a hierarchical frame. You can have the power equitably distributed. But that entails taking the students seriously.
Society, then you think you'd want to inhabit power structures that are more equitable as you develop, as opposed to, if you want an authoritarian society, then the educational procedures should be more authoritarian. And I think that really gets down to it is, obviously you and I don't perceive the authoritarian structure of society as the best way to do things. And so the question then is reforming education to actually match a better society, a more beautiful society that we know is possible, a better world.
I think what's crucial about that, maybe to finish up here, is that the narrative needs, in a more radical way, to center on the student. They talk about student education now, but student-centered education, but the student in that frame is an object, not a subject. There's something upon which procedures are performed to elicit a particular outcome. The idea that the student as a subject is someone, as a human being, a full-fledged, card-carrying human being who can participate meaningfully in that process, needs to be, I think, given greater weight in how the whole enterprise is undertaken. So, what would you say about that?
Yeah. I think, oftentimes when you kind of start interjecting, you summarize what I've said way better. And I think at the heart of it, that's the idea, is treating really the student as a person, and as a human, and so that makes them the subject, not the object, not the thing to be acted upon. I had a professor in college who was a philosophy professor, and he really said learning is participatory. You cannot lay there and just let it happen to you. And we almost structure education like that. It's we're just going to download it into their brain. We're not going to ask them what they want to learn, how they learn best. We're not going to treat them like we would any other human being. If you want to use the restroom, you have to ask. I'm going to give you a task and you just have to do it no matter what. That's ridiculous. You could never approach another adult in society and say, hey, you have to do this task now because I told you to. Unless, of course, there's a reason. For example, you work for a job and your boss says, hey, can you take out the trash? Because you are worker at this job, and that's part of the agreement that you've made. Sure, that makes sense. But school, there's no agreement really for the child. It's just like, hey, you're a child, therefore you're a part of school, therefore I can tell you what to do. You have no say. And I think making all those compulsory statements about someone's life, about them, what they have to do, is really at the core of what's hurting society and what's hurting education. Is there's no, the students are the subject, the center of it. It's really just about the power structures, the compulsory power structures.
Fight the power, Devin. Fight it.
That's
right. That's right. So, well, I'll tell you what, man. I think we can go ahead and wrap it up there. I think that's a natural sort of breaking point. And as always, thanks for coming on and talking with me.
Tom, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You're a great friend, and I wish we could live next to each other, but it's fun to do things like this.
Absolutely. Well, we need to get some Go going.
Yeah, maybe
last time Devin was on, we talked about Go, artificial intelligence, and so forth. And that's always that's a topic which we could revisit. But we'll stop for now. So, and Devin, I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon, Tom. Take care.
Ciao.